On the edge of the Sol system, past the orbit of Neptune, where the sun was little more than a bright star and sunlight barely mattered anymore, there was a shipyard that did not appear on any Concorde star chart. It had been built in pieces over 11 years, brought out in cargo runs, disguised as scientific survey missions, assembled by workers who signed contracts, promising decades in prison if they ever spoke of what they built. The people who worked there called it the yard, nothing more, because giving it a real name felt like inviting attention it could not afford. Inside the yard, in a berth big enough to swallow 3 ordinary Concorde warships, sat a vessel called the ISS Prometheus, flagship of a fleet that had never fired a shot in anger. Its captain was a woman named Sarah Cade, 44 years old, with gray already showing at her temples, and a service record that, on paper, looked ordinary. She had spent 11 years training a crew for a war she was not allowed to fight, watching news reports of human ships dying at the front, while she ran drill after drill in the dark beyond Neptune, and every single day of it had felt like a kind of torture she could not explain to anyone outside the program. She was standing in the observation deck, looking out at the black shapes of the other 40 ships riding at anchor around her, when the order came through. It was a short message. It did not need to be long. 6 words, encrypted 3 times over, delivered by a courier drone that had crossed the system in absolute radio silence. Wake the reckoning. Proceed to the front. Cade read it twice, and then a third time, and then she found that her hands were shaking, just slightly, in a way they had not shaken in years. "Commander Ford," she said, without turning around. Her executive officer, a broad-shouldered man named James Ford, who had spent as many years waiting as she had, stepped up beside her. "Captain?" "Sound general quarters. All ships. We're moving." Ford looked at the message on her tablet, and something crossed his face that was not quite a smile, and not quite grief, the particular expression of a man who has trained for something so long that its arrival feels almost unreal. "After 11 years, he said quietly. "After 11 years, Cade agreed. "Let's see if it was worth it." Word spread through the Prometheus in minutes, and then through the rest of the fleet, ship to ship, deck to deck. 6,000 people who had spent a decade of their lives in near total secrecy, cut off from family, cut off from any real news except what filtered down through official channels, began final preparations for a war none of them had ever actually fought. There was no cheering. Anyone watching a recruitment video might have expected cheering, the kind of triumphant noise that always seemed to follow big announcements in the media. What actually happened was quieter and stranger. People went to their stations. People checked their equipment one more time, even though they had checked it 100 times before. A few people, alone in their bunks or in the narrow corridors between shifts, allowed themselves exactly one moment of something like fear, and then put it away, because there was no room left for it now. In the Prometheus's forward gunnery bay, a young weapons technician named Marcus Diallo ran his hand along the housing of the ship's main cannon, a weapon system that existed nowhere else in known space, built from principles that human engineers had reverse-engineered from 3 different alien technologies, and then improved upon in ways the original designers would not have recognized. He had helped calibrate that cannon for 4 years. He had never once fired it at a living target. "You ready?" asked the technician next to him, an older woman named Priya Sethi, who had been with the program since the beginning. "No," Diallo admitted. "You?" "No," Sethi said. "Nobody's ready for their first real fight. Doesn't matter how long you trained." She checked the last connection on the housing and stepped back. "But we're about as ready as anybody's ever going to be. And there's people dying out there who don't have a fleet like this one coming for them yet. So we go anyway." 41 ships lit their engines in the dark past Neptune, one after another, a long, slow burn that would take them across the width of human space, and then out beyond it, into Concorde territory, toward a war that had already written humanity off as a species that fought hard and lost anyway. None of the other Concorde powers tracked the launch. None of them were looking in that direction. As far as the wider galaxy was concerned, humanity had exactly the fleet everyone already knew about. The ordinary ships that had bled and died at Corvassa and a dozen engagements before it. They did not know about the other 41 ships now falling into formation in the dark. or about the 6,000 people aboard them who had spent a decade being told, over and over, in briefings and drills and long silent nights, you are the last resort. You are what happens when everything else fails. Train like the ending of the world depends on you, because someday, it might. That day had come. The war had been going on for 6 years before the galaxy noticed humans at all. That was the joke the older species liked to tell, in their own languages, in their own private channels, far from human ears. Humanity had joined the Galactic Concord only a decade earlier, after the Varan Accord opened contact with Earth. Back then, humans were seen as a curiosity. They were loud, they were fast to anger, and they built machines that broke down twice as often as they should. Nobody thought they would matter much. Nobody thought they would need to matter much, because the war against the Krith Dominion was supposed to be a war fought by the old powers, the Centaur Assembly, the Miraxi Combine, the Ordovan Free Worlds. Humanity was invited to send ships mostly so it could learn its place among the stars, and maybe pay its dues in blood the way every new species did. Then the old powers began to lose. The Krith were not like anything the Concord had fought before. They did not want territory. They did not want tribute. They wanted silence. Every world the Krith took was stripped of its people and its language and its history, turned into staging ground for more attacks, more silence spreading outward like ink in water. Their ships were grown, not built, vast black hulls that healed themselves in battle, crewed by soldiers who did not seem to feel fear or pain the way other beings did. For 6 years, the Concord fleets had thrown themselves against the Krith advance and had been thrown back, world by world, system by system. By the time the human fleet arrived at the front, the War Council had already given up hope of winning. They hoped only to slow the end. Human Battlegroup Ares was the first human fleet to see real combat. 22 ships under the command of Admiral Renata Ibarra, sent to hold the line at the Corvassa system, a mining world with almost 500,000 people, and no strategic value, except that it sat between the Krith advance and the Concord capital. The Centaur High Command had not expected the humans to hold. They had expected them to die usefully, buying a day or two of time, while real reinforcements were gathered from somewhere, anywhere. The humans did not know that was the plan. They thought they were being trusted with something important. Admiral Ibarra stood on the bridge of her flagship, the ISS Marcus Aurelius, and watched the sensor plot fill with red icons. The Krith fleet had come out of nowhere, the way it always did, ships peeling out of the dark like teeth from a closing jaw. Her tactical officer, a young lieutenant named Priya Okafor, read off the numbers, in a voice that stayed steady, only because she had trained herself to keep it that way. 140 enemy vessels, Admiral. Composition unclear. Could be more behind the lead elements. Understood, Ibarra said. She did not raise her voice. She had learned a long time ago that panic was contagious, and so was calm, and it was her job to decide which one filled the ship. Signal the fleet. We hold position at the mining colony. We do not let them past us. 22 ships against 140. Even the newest ensign on the bridge understood what those numbers meant, but nobody argued. Humanity had come to the stars late, and it had come to this war even later, and there was a stubbornness in human culture that the other species had noted with a kind of distant amusement, the sense that humans did not know when to quit, because quitting had never once worked out for them across their whole bloody history. It was not bravery exactly. It was closer to habit. The battle at Corvassa lasted 4 hours. It should have lasted 20 minutes. The Krith fleet advanced in their usual formation, a slow, crushing wall of dark ships that absorbed fire and kept coming. Human weapons technology was not as advanced as the Centaur or the Miraxi. Human shields were weaker. Human hulls were thinner. But human tactics were strange, unpredictable in a way that seemed to genuinely confuse the Krith commanders, who were used to enemies that followed known patterns of Concord doctrine. Ibarra split her fleet into 3 groups instead of 1. She sent her smallest, fastest ships in low, skimming the mining colony's outer debris field, using broken asteroids and old freight wreckage as cover. She held her heavier ships back, waiting, letting the Krith come to her, instead of meeting them in open space where their numbers would matter most. They're changing formation, Okafor called out. They don't like it. They're trying to encircle the fast group. Let them try, Ibarra said. Group 2, converge on my mark. It was not enough. Of course it was not enough. 22 ships could not truly stop 140. And everyone on that bridge knew it, in the cold part of their mind, even while the rest of them fought. Ship after ship went dark on the plot. The ISS Firebrand took a direct hit and broke into 3 pieces that tumbled silently apart. 300 crew gone in an instant, a number that would appear on casualty lists back on Earth in a few days and would be read by families who did not yet know they had lost someone. The ISS Kestrel held the line at the debris field for 11 minutes past when it should have retreated, giving 3 transport ships time to get civilians off Corvasa's surface, before it too was destroyed. By the end of the 4th hour, Battle Group Ares had lost 16 of its 22 ships. The mining colony was evacuated, barely, at a cost that made the survivors sick to think about later. Admiral Ibarra brought the 6 remaining ships out through a hole in the Krith line that her fast group had bought with their own destruction, and the Krith fleet, damaged and slowed but very much intact, moved on to take the empty colony anyway. It was, by any measure that mattered, a loss. But something strange had happened, and the sensor recordings from a dozen Concord listening posts across the sector had caught it. The Krith fleet that arrived at Corvasa with 140 ships left with 91. Nobody in 6 years of war had made the Krith pay that price for a target of so little value. The old species who watched the recordings, replayed over and over in war rooms across a dozen systems, did not know what to make of it. Some called it luck. Some called it recklessness that would not work twice. A few, a very few, began to wonder if the newcomers understood something about war that the old species had forgotten. News of Corvasa reached Earth 11 days later, filtered through Concord relay stations and human translators, who tried to make the losses sound less brutal than they were, and mostly failed. In a low, plain briefing room outside what had once been Geneva, a small group of officers and 1 civilian sat around a table and read the casualty reports without speaking for a long time. The civilian was named Daniel Osei, and officially, he held no military rank at all. He worked, when anyone asked, for something called the Office of Strategic Reserve, a name so boring that people's eyes slid right past it. He was 51 years old, quiet, with the kind of face that did not photograph well, and was therefore rarely photographed. He had been in that room for every human engagement of the war so far, and he had said almost nothing in any of them, which was itself unusual, because everyone else in the room outranked him, and yet nobody interrupted him when he finally spoke. "How many more colonies like Corvasa do we have on the projected Krith advance?" he asked. General Marcus Webb, who commanded what remained of Earth's home fleet, answered without looking up from the report. 19. Over the next 8 months, assuming the advance holds its current pace. We don't have the ships to hold all of them. We don't have the ships to hold half of them. And the Concord reinforcements they promised us? Delayed again. The Centaur Assembly is fighting 3 council votes about resource allocation, while their own worlds burn. The Meraxi have pulled back to defend their core systems, and are calling it a strategic redeployment. Webb's voice had gone flat with something that was not quite anger, and not quite despair, a kind of exhaustion that had been building for years. We are going to lose this war, Daniel. Not eventually, soon. Within 2 years, maybe less, the Krith reach every inhabited human world, and then they reach Earth. Daniel Osei nodded slowly, and then he did something that made every other person in that room sit up straighter. He smiled, just slightly, the kind of smile that belonged to a man who had been waiting a long time for a particular question to finally get asked. "Then it's time," he said, "to bring the fleet home." Nobody in the room reacted the way he expected them to, because nobody in the room except General Webb knew what he meant. Webb's expression did not change, but something in his shoulders eased, the way a man's shoulders ease when a weight he has carried alone for a long time is finally about to be shared. "Explain," said Admiral Chen, the ranking naval officer present, a woman who had spent 30 years in service and did not appreciate surprises. Daniel Osei folded his hands on the table. 11 years ago, before first contact with the Concorde, before we knew any of this was coming, a joint program was started between 6 governments and a group of private research consortiums. Officially, it does not exist. Unofficially, it has been operating out of a shipyard in the outer system, past Neptune, in a construction zone we told the Concorde was a scientific survey installation. We have been building a fleet there, not a defensive fleet. Not a fleet meant to hold colonies or protect trade routes. A fleet meant to end wars quickly, built by people who studied every conflict humanity ever fought, and asked one question: what does it take to make an enemy stop, permanently, as fast as possible? Why, Chen said carefully, have I never heard of this? Because the people who approved it understood something that is hard to say out loud, Osei answered. They understood that first contact with an advanced galactic community was going to go one of two ways. Either the Concord would welcome us as equals and everything would be fine, or the galaxy would eventually show us its teeth, the way every powerful group eventually does to the newest member at the table, and we would need something in reserve that nobody outside a very small circle knew existed. A fleet that was not registered with the Concord. A fleet that had never fought under Concord rules of engagement, never been observed, never been measured. We call it the Second Fleet. Some of the engineers who built it call it something else. They call it the Reckoning. The room was silent for a long moment. How many ships? General Webb asked, though from his tone it was clear he already knew the answer, and simply wanted it said aloud for the record. 41, Osei said. Built larger, and stranger, and with technology we did not share with the Concord during the trade negotiations. Weapons we developed after studying every alien weapon system we have ever encountered, and asking how to beat it. Crews who have spent a decade training for exactly one kind of mission, and who have never fought a real battle, not one, not against anyone. Then how do we know they're any good? Chen asked. Daniel Osei's small, patient smile did not waver. We don't, not for certain. What we know is that the alternative is watching humanity lose a war it cannot win, with the ships it currently has. What we know is that somewhere out past Neptune, 41 ships and roughly 6,000 men and women have spent 10 years waiting for exactly this moment, training for a fight nobody else in the galaxy knows they are ready for. The Concord has watched us lose for 6 years. They have started to believe humans are simply not very good at war. I would like very much for them to be wrong. General Webb finally looked up from the casualty report, and for the first time in the meeting his eyes held something other than exhaustion. Send the order, he said. Wake the Reckoning. 3,000 light-years away, on a Kreeth command vessel drifting in the silent aftermath of the Corvassa attack, an alien intelligence that the Kreeth called a vessel mind processed the battle data from the engagement and filed it, along with every other piece of data about the species called humanity, into a threat category that had not changed in 6 years of contact. Minimal. Persistent, the vessel mind noted, in the strange looping thought patterns that passed for its cognition. Persistent and costly to eliminate, but minimal. It did not know, could not know, that 41 ships in a hidden shipyard, past the edge of a system it had marked for later conquest, had just received an order that 6,000 humans had trained a decade to hear. It did not know that the war it believed it was winning had, in that moment, only just begun. Across the Concord's listening networks, in council chambers on a dozen worlds, delegates argued about troop allocations and resource quotas, and whether the humans could be trusted to hold any line at all after Corvassa, and none of them noticed a change in the shipping manifests moving through the outer edge of the Sol system, a change that would have meant nothing to them even if they had. Ships moving from a survey installation that officially held no military value, 41 dark shapes falling into formation in the cold and the quiet, beginning the long burn toward the front. The galaxy had watched humanity lose for 6 years, and had started, quietly, to write them off. It had not yet seen what humanity had been building in the dark. 3 weeks after Corvassa, the Kreeth Dominion took the human colony world of New Shenzhen, and this time there was no admiral clever enough to buy time, no fast ships to skim through a debris field and confuse the enemy formation. New Shenzhen had 400,000 people and a single squadron of aging patrol ships meant for policing asteroid mining claims, not fighting a war. The Kreeth fleet that arrived in orbit numbered 60 ships, more than enough, and the local commander, a young captain named Rosa Delgado, who had never expected to face a real battle in her career, made the only choice she believed she had. She ordered every ship she had to hold the line long enough for evacuation transports to escape the system, and then she died along with most of her crew when her ship took direct fire trying to shield a transport carrying 11,000 civilians. The transport made it out, New Shenzhen did not. By the time the evacuation fleet limped away, 310,000 people were still on the surface, and the Krith did what the Krith always did. Nobody in the wider galaxy called it a massacre in the official reports, because the Concord Council had learned, over 6 years of war, that the word made people ask uncomfortable questions about why the Concord fleets kept losing worlds instead of protecting them. The official reports called it a strategic withdrawal from an untenable position. Everyone who read those reports carefully enough to notice the death toll knew what the words actually meant. On the Centaur homeworld, in a council chamber built from pale stone that had stood for 11,000 years, a delegate named Ambassador Vrenna Kalth Centaur watched the New Shenzhen briefing with an expression that her own species would have read as careful neutrality, and that a human observer might have called barely restrained contempt. Vrenna had been the Concord's chief liaison to the human delegation since first contact. She had argued, in those early days, that humanity should be welcomed as a full and equal member of galactic society, that their strange energy and stubborn persistence might be an asset worth cultivating. She had spent political capital on that argument. She had staked some small portion of her reputation on it. 6 years of watching humans lose battle after battle had worn that argument down to almost nothing. Another world lost, said the delegate beside her, an older centaur named Orith, who had opposed the human alliance from the very beginning. Another 300,000 dead, because we gave the newcomers a line to hold, that they were never equipped to hold. This is the 4th time, Vrenna. The 4th time we have trusted human military judgment and paid for it in Concord citizens who happen to live under a human flag. They fought, Vrenna said, though even to her own ears the words sounded thin. They died, Orith corrected. There is a difference, and the difference matters to the families of the dead. I will be recommending to the full council that human forces be withdrawn from frontline positions and reassigned to rear area logistics, where their enthusiasm can do less damage. It is not a punishment, it is simply realism. The humans do not have the technology, the experience, or apparently the tactical sense to hold ground against the Krith. Continuing to give them ground to hold is not an act of respect for their independence. It is a slow way of killing them and everyone unlucky enough to live near them. Vrenna did not answer immediately. She was old enough and had lived long enough among the endless small cruelties of Concord politics to know that Orith was not entirely wrong, and that was the worst part. The numbers did not lie. Humanity had lost every major engagement of the war so far. They fought harder than the numbers suggested they should, inflicted more damage than expected, but they still lost. And dead was dead whether you died fighting bravely or fighting badly. I will speak to the human delegation before any vote is called, she said finally. They deserve the chance to respond. Of course, Orith said, in a tone that suggested he did not think it would matter, and privately, though she would never have admitted it aloud, Vrenna was not certain he was wrong. She requested a channel to the human government that evening, and was surprised when the response came back not from a general or an admiral, the people she usually spoke with, but from a quiet civilian she had met perhaps twice before, a man named Daniel Osei, who held some vague administrative title she had never quite understood the purpose of. He appeared on her screen, sitting in what looked like an ordinary office, calm, in a way that struck her as strange, given what she was about to tell him. Ambassador, he said, I understand there's a vote coming. There is, Vrenna said. I wanted to give you the chance to prepare a response, or a plea for more time, before it happens. The council believes human forces should be pulled from the front. Given the losses at New Shenzhen, given the pattern of the last 6 years, I am not certain I can argue against that position with any confidence. Something in Osei's expression shifted, so slightly that she almost missed it, a kind of quiet patience that reminded her, oddly, of certain very old Centaur elders she had known in her youth, the ones who had lived through wars long before she was born, and carried themselves with a stillness that came from having already survived the worst thing they could imagine. Ambassador Kalth, he said, I would ask the council for exactly one thing. Not more troops, not more time on any particular front. Just this. Do not vote to withdraw human forces for 30 days. After 30 days, if you still believe humanity cannot hold a line, I will not argue with the council's decision, and I will not ask again. Vrenna studied him for a long moment. 30 days is not a long time, Mr. Osei, but it is long enough for more worlds to fall if I am wrong to grant it. Give me a reason to grant it. I can't tell you the reason, Osei said. Not yet. But I can tell you that in 30 days, you will understand exactly why I asked, and I do not believe you will regret giving us the time. It was not much of an answer, and Vrenna knew that if she brought it back to the council exactly as he had given it to her, Orith and the others who agreed with him would tear it apart in minutes. A civilian with no visible military authority, asking for patience based on nothing he was willing to explain, while human colonists kept dying on the front line. And yet there was something in the calm certainty of his voice, something that did not match the desperate, exhausted tone she had grown used to hearing from human officials over the last 6 years. He did not sound like a man begging for more time to lose slower. He sounded, she thought slowly, like a man who already knew how the story ended. I will bring your request to the council, she said. I make no promises about the outcome. That's all I'm asking, Osei said, and the channel closed. Far from the council chambers and the political maneuvering, out past the edge of Concord territory, the Second Fleet continued its long approach toward the front. It had been 11 days since they left the yard, and the ships had settled into the rhythm of long-haul travel, drills running constantly, the crews using every spare hour to sharpen skills they had trained for a decade, but never truly tested. Aboard the Prometheus, Captain Sarah Cade held a private meeting with her senior officers in a briefing room that smelled faintly of recycled air and too much coffee. A hollow display in the center of the table showed the current state of the war, updated as best they could manage from intercepted Concord communications. A grim map of red systems marking Krith advances, and a shrinking patch of blue marking what remained under Concord and human control. New Shenzhen fell 4 days ago, said her intelligence officer, a sharp, quiet man named Elias Brandt. 310,000 civilians. The Concord Council is holding an emergency session in 26 days to vote on pulling human forces off the front entirely. 26 days, Cade repeated. We're 11 days out from the nearest active front, assuming we push the engines harder than the manuals recommend. We push them harder than the manuals recommend, said Commander Ford, without hesitation. Cade looked around the table at the faces of the people who had trained beside her for over a decade, people she trusted more than she trusted almost anyone else alive, and felt the particular weight of command settle onto her shoulders in a way that no amount of drilling had fully prepared her for. Drills were drills. This was going to be real. We're not going in blind, she said. Brandt, I want a full intelligence picture on Krith tactics, ship classes, weapon signatures, everything the Concord has gathered in 6 years of losing to them. I want it cross-referenced against everything our own analysts predicted a decade ago when they designed this fleet's weapons and tactics. If our people were right about how to beat these things, I want to know it before we're in the middle of finding out the hard way. If they were wrong about something, I want to know that even more. Already running the analysis, Brandt said. Preliminary numbers are interesting. Interesting how? The Krith rely on mass and self-healing hull technology. Their ships absorb sustained fire better than almost anything the Concord uses, because the hull regenerates faster than conventional weapons can damage it. That's why Concord fleets lose engagements even when they inflict what should be crippling damage. The Krith ships just knit themselves back together and keep coming. Brandt pulled up a technical diagram, dense with data. Our weapon systems were designed around a very different principle. Instead of sustained damage over time, our primary cannons are built to deliver massive instantaneous energy spikes, faster than any known regeneration process can respond to. On paper, our weapons should punch through Krith's self-healing hulls in a way Concord weapons simply cannot. On paper, Cade repeated. On paper, Brandt agreed. We won't know for certain until we test it against a real target. Cade nodded slowly, turning the information over. 10 years of secret research, guided by analysts who had studied the growing rumors of an aggressive expansionist power somewhere beyond Concord space, who had built weapons specifically to counter a threat that had not officially existed yet when the program began. It felt less like preparation now, and more like prophecy, and that thought unsettled her more than she wanted to admit out loud. Ford, she said, signal the fleet. We increase speed by 15%, effective immediately. I want us at the front in 9 days, not 11. That'll strain the engines on 6 of our older ships, Ford warned. Then we fix what breaks, and we keep moving, Cade said. 26 days until the Concord Council votes to give up on us. We are going to be in that fight long before that vote happens. And when it happens, I want the Council looking at evidence instead of promises." Word of the approaching Second Fleet still had not reached the wider Concord, and it would not reach the Krith for some time yet. But aboard the Prometheus and the other 40 ships of the fleet, a new kind of energy had begun to replace the long tension of 11 years of waiting. It was not confidence exactly. Nobody aboard that fleet was foolish enough to feel truly confident before their first real battle. It was something closer to purpose, sharp and immediate, the feeling of a decade of preparation finally about to be tested against reality. In the mess hall of the Prometheus, Marcus Diallo sat across from Priya Sethi, both of them picking at reheated meals neither one particularly wanted, and found himself thinking about Nu Shenzhen, about numbers that had gone from abstract briefing statistics to something that sat heavy in his chest. 310,000 people. He had grown up not far from a city about that size. "You hear the latest casualty numbers?" he asked. "I heard," Sethi said quietly. "We could have been there. If they'd sent for us a year ago, 2 years ago, instead of keeping us hidden out past Neptune running drills against simulated targets." Sethi set down her fork and looked at him with the patient, tired expression of someone who had turned the same thought over in her own mind more times than she could count. "Maybe," she said, "or maybe if they'd sent us before we were ready, we'd have gone in half-trained against an enemy nobody understood yet, and we'd have lost just as badly as everyone else, and there wouldn't be a second fleet left for anybody to send anywhere." "I don't know the answer, Marcus. Nobody does. All I know is we're moving now, and there's a war out there that needs ending, and we're the closest thing humanity has ever built to a weapon that might actually end it." Diallo was quiet for a moment. Outside the small viewport at the end of the mess hall, the stars slid slowly past as the Prometheus continued its long burn toward the front. 40 other ships holding formation around it in the dark. 6,000 people, carrying a decade of secret preparation toward a war the rest of the galaxy did not yet know they were entering. 9 days, he said finally. 9 days, Sethi agreed, and went back to her meal, because there was nothing else useful left to say, and because in 9 days, all the words in the galaxy would stop mattering, and only the fight itself would be left to answer the question everyone aboard that fleet had spent a decade waiting to ask. Were they ready? Was any of it enough? The Concord had watched humanity lose for 6 years, and had begun to write them off as a species that fought bravely and lost anyway, a species better suited to rear-area logistics than to holding a line against the Krith. Ambassador Vrenna Kalth carried a fragile 30-day reprieve back to a council that did not want to grant it, based on nothing more than the calm certainty in one quiet civilian's voice. The Concord Council met to debate the 30-day reprieve 2 days later, in the same pale stone chamber where Vrenna had first heard the news of Nu Shenzhen. Delegates from a dozen member species filled the tiered seats, translators murmuring in the background as arguments passed between languages that had evolved on worlds separated by thousands of light-years. Orith spoke first, laying out the casualty figures from the last 6 years, with the practiced precision of a man who had given this speech, in one form or another, many times before. 4 major engagements, he said. 4 significant losses of Concord territory under human command, each one accompanied by civilian casualties in the hundreds of thousands. I do not say this to diminish human courage. Human forces have fought with a ferocity that surprised many of us when we first invited them into this war. But courage is not victory, and territory held by dying soldiers is territory that still falls. I move that human forces be reassigned to logistics and rear area support, effective immediately, for their own protection, and for the protection of the citizens who live under lines they cannot hold. Vrenna rose when he finished, feeling the weight of 100 alien eyes turned toward her, most of them patient and a few of them openly skeptical. I ask the Council to grant 30 days before any vote is finalized, she said, not because I can offer proof that circumstances will change. I cannot, but I have spoken personally with human leadership, and I was given an assurance, from a source I have reason to trust, that something material will change within that window. I am aware that this is a request based on faith rather than evidence, and I understand if the Council finds that insufficient. But I have watched this species fight for 6 years, watched them lose world after world and keep sending ships anyway, and I do not believe a species with that kind of stubbornness gives up asking for one more chance easily. I would rather grant 30 days and be wrong then take it away and never learn what they were building toward. The vote to grant the delay passed by a narrow margin, 7 votes to 5, with 2 abstentions, and Vrenna felt no particular relief when the result was announced, only the sharp awareness that she had spent political capital she was not certain she could afford to lose, on the word of a man she had met exactly twice. 4 days into the Second Fleet's approach to the front, the first real test came sooner than anyone expected, and it came almost by accident. A Krith scout formation, 5 ships on a routine patrol along what the Krith believed was uncontested space at the edge of their advance, picked up sensor contact with an unknown fleet, moving at high speed through a system the Krith had marked as empty. The scout commander, a Krith officer whose designation translated roughly to Hunt Pattern 7, made the decision any competent scout would make: investigate, identify, and if the contact proved hostile, report back, before engaging a force of unknown size. Captain Cade received the warning from Elias Brandt with the calm focus that had become her default state over the last several days. 5 contacts, Krith configuration, closing on an intercept course, Brandt reported. They haven't engaged. Looks like a scout formation trying to identify us before committing to anything. Do we let them look, or do we make sure they don't get the chance to report back? Ford asked. Cade considered the question for exactly as long as it took to consider the alternative. If the scouts identified the Second Fleet and reported its size, its unfamiliar ship classes, its unknown weapon signatures, back to the wider Krith command structure, the element of surprise that 10 years of secrecy had bought would be spent before the fleet ever reached the actual front. That surprise was, potentially, the single greatest advantage they had. We don't let them report back, Cade said. Brandt, target the lead scout ship. Diallo's team. I want a live test of the primary cannon, now, against a real hull instead of a simulation. Let's find out if 10 years of theory holds up. The order went out, and for the first time in the history of the Second Fleet, one of its ships fired its main weapon at a living enemy target instead of a simulated one. The result was, in Marcus Diallo's own later description to his logbook, both exactly what the models predicted, and somehow still more violent than he had allowed himself to imagine. The energy spike from the Prometheus's forward cannon crossed the intervening distance in a fraction of a second, and struck the lead Krith scout ship's hull, before its vaunted self-healing systems could respond to the damage. The hull did not simply take damage and begin repairing itself the way 6 years of Concord combat reports said it should. It came apart, in one violent instant, a black shape that had existed a moment before scattering into debris, that the Prometheus's sensors struggled to even properly catalog. On the bridge, there was a silence that lasted just a beat too long before Brandt found his voice again. Target destroyed, he said, and something in his tone suggested he was hearing his own words, with the same disbelief as everyone else on the bridge. Single hit, no secondary fire required. The remaining 4 Krith scouts broke formation immediately, peeling away in different directions, some instinct or protocol telling them that whatever they had just encountered was not worth the risk of further investigation. Cade watched them scatter on the tactical display and made a decision in the space of a heartbeat. Let 2 of them go, she said. Destroy the other 2 before they clear scanner range. And the last one? Ford asked. Let it run. Let it report back exactly what it saw. 5 ships that stumbled onto something new, and lost 4 of them in seconds. I want the Krith to know something changed. I want them to wonder what it means. She looked around the bridge at the stunned, quiet faces of her crew. People who had trained for a decade for exactly this moment, and were only now beginning to believe it was real. 10 years of theory, just held up against a live target. Let's see how it holds up against a real fleet. 2 more Krith scouts died in the minutes that followed, destroyed by precise, overwhelming fire from ships that maneuvered with a speed and coordination the surviving Krith scout had never encountered from any Concord vessel in 6 years of war. The last scout ship broke free of pursuit and fled deeper into Krith territory, carrying with it sensor data that would reach Krith High Command within the day, data showing an unknown fleet, unfamiliar in configuration, capable of destroying a Krith warship's self-healing hull in a single strike. Aboard the Prometheus, the mood in the wake of the skirmish was not celebration, it was something quieter and more focused, the particular stillness of people who had just discovered that everything they trained for was real, and that the war ahead of them was going to be exactly as violent as they had always feared, and that they were, perhaps, finally equipped to meet it. 9 days, Marcus Diallo said again that evening, sitting across from Priya Sethi in the mess hall, the words carrying a different weight than they had before. 9 days, Sethi agreed, and this time neither of them needed to say anything more, because for the first time since the fleet left the yard, the abstract idea of the coming battle had become something real, something they had already tasted the edges of, and there was no more room left for doubt about whether they were ready. There was only the war ahead, and the long dark road still left to reach it. 9 days out from the front, the Second Fleet pushed its engines past every safety margin its designers had ever recommended, racing toward a war it had trained a decade to fight, and had, at last, begun to see with its own eyes. The Krith scout ship that escaped the skirmish reached its home fleet within a day, and the sensor data it carried triggered something that had not happened in the 6 years since the Krith Dominion began its advance into Concord space. Genuine hesitation. The vessel mind commanding the nearest Krith battle group processed the data slowly, running the destroyed scout ship's final sensor readings through every threat model it had built over years of studying Concord military capability, and found no match. An unknown fleet. Weapons capable of bypassing self-healing hull regeneration entirely. Ship configurations that resembled nothing in the Concord's known arsenal. The vessel mind did what its kind always did when faced with uncertainty. It escalated its own aggression, rather than its caution, because 6 years of total victory against every Concord fleet it had faced had taught it that hesitation cost more than force. It ordered a full battle fleet, 180 ships, to converge on the human colony world of Meridian Station, the largest remaining human settlement anywhere near the front, a world of nearly 2 million people that the Krith had been circling for months without committing to a full assault. If an unknown threat was approaching from human territory, the vessel mind reasoned, then the surest way to draw it into a battle on Krith terms was to attack the largest, most valuable target that threat would be forced to defend. Word of the Krith fleet's movement toward Meridian Station reached both the Concord Council and the approaching Second Fleet within hours of each other, through very different channels. On the Concord homeworld, Ambassador Vrenna Kalth received the intelligence report in the middle of the night, local time, and read it twice before fully believing what it said. 180 Krith warships, the largest single fleet committed to any engagement in the entire war, converging on a human colony that human forces had no realistic ability to defend. If Meridian Station fell, and every projection suggested it would, the casualty count would dwarf New Shenzhen by an order of magnitude. 2 million people. She thought of Orith's careful, patient argument for pulling human forces off the front, and for the first time in 6 years of watching this war grind through world after world, she found herself hoping, with something close to desperation, that Daniel Osei's calm certainty had not been misplaced. Aboard the Prometheus, the same intelligence reached Captain Sarah Cade through a different route entirely, relayed by human listening posts embedded quietly within Concord communication networks, part of the same decade-long program that had built the Second Fleet itself. She read the report standing in the command center, Commander Ford at her shoulder, and felt something settle into place inside her chest, a clarity that came from finally knowing exactly what the fleet had been built for. 180 ships, Ford said quietly, against a colony with no meaningful defense fleet of its own. How far are we from Meridian Station? Kate asked. Elias Brandt pulled up the navigation charts, calculating the distance with the particular speed of a man who already suspected the answer would not be good enough. At current speed, 3 days, the Kryth fleet will reach Meridian in approximately 36 hours. The math was simple and brutal. The Second Fleet could not reach Meridian Station before the Kryth did. By the time 41 human ships arrived at that system, the colony would already have fallen, or would be in the final hours of falling, and the fleet built for exactly this moment would arrive to find nothing left to save but the wreckage of a battle already lost. Cade stood very still for a long moment, feeling the eyes of her bridge crew on her, waiting. Push the engines to maximum, she said. Every ship, I don't care what the manuals say about safety margins anymore. If there is any way to shave hours off that arrival time, I want it found in the next 10 minutes. Even at maximum burn, we're looking at best case 29 hours, Brandt said. The Kryth fleet arrives in 36. We might make it before Meridian falls completely, but we will not make it before the battle starts. Then we arrive in the middle of it. Cade said. "Signal Meridian Station's local defense authority. Tell them help is coming. And tell them to hold as long as they possibly can. Because every hour they buy is an hour closer to a fleet that can actually turn the tide." On Meridian Station itself, the message reached a woman named Governor Elena Voss, the civilian administrator of a colony that had never expected to face a battle of this scale, whose entire defense force consisted of 6 aging Concorde surplus patrol ships and a planetary shield network that had been built to stop meteor strikes, not sustain bombardment from 180 warships. She read the message twice, sitting alone in her office, with the lights of the colony's largest city visible through the window behind her. 2 million people going about their evening, with no real understanding yet of what was bearing down on them from the dark. "Help is coming," she read aloud, to no one, testing the weight of the words. 29 hours. The Kreeth fleet would arrive in 36. That left only 7 hours of margin. 7 hours in which Meridian Station would need to survive a battle against overwhelming force, with almost nothing to fight back with, in the hope that a fleet nobody had told her existed, until this exact moment, would arrive in time to matter. She called an emergency session of the Colonial Council within the hour, and delivered the news as calmly as she could manage, watching the faces of people she had known for years absorb the reality of what was coming. There was no possibility of a full evacuation in the time remaining. Meridian Station's transport capacity, even running every available ship at maximum load around the clock, could move perhaps 300,000 people off-world before the Kreeth fleet arrived. That left over 1.5 million people with no choice but to shelter in place and hope that whatever help had been promised actually came, and came in time. "We prioritized children, the elderly, and essential medical personnel for the evacuation transports," Voss said, her voice steady only through sheer effort of will. "Everyone else prepares planetary shelters. We activate every civil defense protocol we have. And we hold on, because that is the only option left to us." The next 30 hours became, for the people of Meridian Station, a blur of frantic preparation, layered over a slow, grinding dread that grew heavier with every passing hour. Transport ships lifted off in a continuous stream, packed far beyond their rated capacity, carrying children separated from parents who stayed behind to make room for one more family. Elderly patients moved from hospital beds directly onto cargo holds converted into makeshift medical bays. Governor Voss did not sleep. She moved between the Evacuation Coordination Center and the Planetary Defense Headquarters, making decision after decision, with an exhaustion that had stopped registering as exhaustion, and had become simply the texture of every waking moment. 26 hours after the warning arrived, the 6 patrol ships that made up Meridian Station's entire defense fleet took position in high orbit, their crews fully aware that they were not expected to win, only to slow the inevitable by whatever margin they could manage. The Kreeth fleet arrived on schedule, 180 warships dropping out of transit space, in a formation that darkened the tactical displays of every sensor station on the planet below. The 6 patrol ships engaged immediately, buying time in the only way available to them, and were destroyed within the first 11 minutes of the battle. The planetary shield network, never designed for this kind of sustained assault, began failing within the first hour, section by section, as Kreeth warships methodically targeted the generator stations that maintained it. Aboard the Prometheus, 20 hours into the highest speed transit any human fleet had ever attempted, Captain Cade received a continuous stream of updates from Meridian Station's defense network, each one worse than the last. The patrol fleet destroyed, the shield network failing. The first Kreeth ground forces beginning to deploy toward the outskirts of the colony's largest cities. "How long?" she asked Brant, not for the first time. 9 hours to arrival, Brant said. "The shield network has approximately 3 hours left before full collapse, based on the current rate of degradation." 9 hours to arrival. 3 hours until the shield failed entirely, and the Kreeth ground assault began in earnest, against a population with nowhere left to run. The math was, once again, simple and brutal, and this time there was no way to close the gap through speed alone. Cade stood in the command center of a ship built for exactly this kind of moment. 10 years of secret preparation, compressed into a single unbearable stretch of waiting, and made the only decision that remained available to her. "Ford, I want every fast attack craft we have, everything capable of independent long-range transit, launched now, ahead of the main fleet, running at whatever speed their engines can survive. They won't be enough to win the battle alone, but they might be enough to buy Meridian a few more hours, and a few more hours might mean thousands of lives before the main fleet arrives. That's a one-way trip for some of those crews, Ford said quietly. They won't have fuel reserves to retreat if it goes bad. I know, Cade said, and the weight of that knowledge sat visibly on her for a moment, before she pushed it aside, because there was no time left for anything but the decision itself. Ask for volunteers. I won't order anyone into that gap, but I believe we'll get more volunteers than we have ships to send. She was right. Within 20 minutes, every fast attack craft in the Second Fleet had a full volunteer crew, more than enough to fill every seat twice over, and Cade found herself standing at the launch bay watching 8 small, fast ships peel away from the main fleet formation and vanish into transit space ahead of the rest, carrying perhaps 400 people into a battle that the main fleet could not reach in time to support. Among the volunteers was Marcus Diallo, who had transferred his weapons expertise to one of the attack craft the moment the call went out, standing now in a cramped gunnery station, far smaller than the one he had trained on for a decade, watching the transit countdown tick toward 0. Second thoughts? Asked the pilot beside him, a young woman named Captain Alicia Reyes, who had volunteered to lead the small strike group. A few, Diallo admitted. Not enough to change my mind. Good, Reyes said, because we're about to find out if everything we trained for actually works, 4 hours before anybody else gets the chance to. The transit countdown reached 0, and 8 small human ships dropped out of faster-than-light travel, directly into the middle of a battle that had already been raging for hours, into the burning wreckage of Meridian Station's outer defenses, into a fight that the rest of the Second Fleet was still 5 hours away from reaching. Behind them, the main body of the fleet pushed its engines harder than any human vessel had ever been pushed, racing toward a battle that had already begun without them, carrying the last, best hope that 2 million people on a burning colony world had left. The 8 ships of the strike group, designated Vanguard Flight by Captain Reyes over the shared comm channel in the seconds after transit, dropped into a scene that none of their training simulations had ever quite managed to capture. Meridian Station's outer orbital space was a graveyard of burning wreckage. The 6 patrol ships and dozens of civilian vessels caught trying to flee, reduced to drifting debris fields, lit by the slow orange glow of atmospheric fires, visible even from orbit. The Creeley fleet had spread out across the system, more than 100 ships methodically working through the last of the SHIELD network's failing generator stations, while a smaller detachment began deploying troop transports toward the surface. Report, Reyes called over the channel, her voice tight but controlled. SHIELD network at 11% and falling, came the response from Meridian Station's remaining defense coordinator, a voice ragged with exhaustion. We have Krith ground forces beginning deployment over the southern continent. If that shield goes down completely before your main fleet arrives, we lose orbital denial entirely, and this becomes a ground war we cannot win. Reyes looked at the tactical display, 8 ships against more than 100, and made the only calculation that mattered. Then we don't let the shield go down. Vanguard Flight, target priority is the Krith ships bombarding the generator stations. We are not here to win this battle. We are here to keep that shield up until the fleet arrives. Diallo, how's that cannon feeling? Charged and ready, Diallo said, and was faintly surprised to find that his voice came out steadier than he felt. The 8 ships broke formation and dove toward the largest concentration of Krith vessels near the failing shield generators, moving with a speed and precision that came from a decade of drilling for exactly this kind of engagement, even if none of them had ever truly believed they would face it outnumbered nearly 15-1. Diallo's first shot found a Krith cruiser mid-bombardment, the same instantaneous energy spike that had destroyed the scout ship days earlier tearing through its hull before its regeneration systems could respond. The ship broke apart, and for just a moment, the Krith bombardment pattern near that generator station faltered as nearby vessels registered the loss and adjusted formation. It was not enough to win. Everyone aboard Vanguard Flight understood that from the first minute of the engagement. But it did not need to win. It needed only to buy time, and for that single purpose, 8 ships moving fast and hitting hard proved to be exactly enough, at least for a while. They struck the Krith formation from unpredictable angles, breaking away before the numerically superior fleet could bring its full weight to bear. picking off ships engaged in bombardment runs, and then retreating into the cover of the drifting debris fields before Krith vessels could return fire in force. Within the first hour, Vanguard Flight had destroyed 11 Krith warships and damaged perhaps 20 more, a rate of exchange that would have seemed impossible against the same enemy just weeks earlier. But the cost was not zero. The third hour of the engagement cost them the ISS Solace, one of the 8 attack craft, destroyed when a coordinated Krith strike finally caught it exposed between debris fields, its entire crew of 51, lost in an instant, that registered on the tactical display as nothing more than a red icon going dark. Reyes felt that loss land somewhere deep and quiet inside her chest, and did not have time to feel it properly, because the battle did not pause to allow for grief. Shield network holding at 6%, the ground coordinator reported, her voice a mixture of desperate hope and disbelief. You're keeping them off the last 2 generator stations. How long can you hold? As long as it takes, Reyes said, and meant it, even though the math in front of her suggested that as long as it takes might be longer than 7 ships could realistically survive. On the surface of Meridian Station, in a shelter buried beneath the Colonial Administration building, Governor Elena Voss watched the same tactical feed on a secondary monitor, 7 small human ships weaving through a battle against overwhelming odds, buying every minute they possibly could for a fleet still hours away. She thought of the 300,000 people who had made it off-world in the evacuation transports, and the 1.5 million who had not, sheltering now in whatever shelters the colony had managed to build, listening to the distant thunder of orbital battle through walls of reinforced concrete, and praying that the shield held long enough for the rest of the promised help to arrive. They're not going to be able to hold forever, said her aide, a quiet young man named Tobias Reyna who had not slept in over a day. I know, Voss said, but they're buying us minutes, and right now, minutes are the only currency that matters. In the 4th hour of the battle, Vanguard Flight lost a second ship, the ISS Meridian's Hope, and the surviving 6 pulled back into a tighter defensive formation around the last functioning shield generator, no longer able to strike and retreat with the same freedom they had used earlier, forced instead into a grinding stand that both Reyes and Diallo understood, without needing to say it aloud, they were not going to be able to sustain much longer. Diallo's gunnery station had taken damage in the last exchange, forcing him to manually recalibrate the primary cannon between every shot, each firing sequence taking precious seconds they no longer had to spare. Fleet status, Reyes called over the comm, her voice betraying, for the first time since the engagement began, the strain of hours spent fighting a battle that felt increasingly unwinnable. The answer came not from Meridian Station's coordinator, but from a new voice entering the channel, one that made every surviving member of Vanguard Flight feel something loosen in their chest for the first time in hours. This is Captain Sarah Cade, ISS Prometheus, to all Vanguard Flight vessels. The second fleet is 30 minutes from transit arrival. Hold that generator station. Help is almost here. 30 minutes. To 6 exhausted ships that had already fought for 4 hours against odds that should have destroyed them twice over. 30 minutes felt like both an eternity and no time at all, and Reyes found herself laughing, a short, exhausted sound with no real humor in it, because there was nothing left to do but exactly what they had been doing since the moment they arrived. Aboard the Prometheus, Captain Cade stood at the center of her bridge, watching the tactical plot fill with the outline of the coming battle, the burning shell of Meridian Station's outer defenses, the 6 surviving ships of Vanguard Flight holding a shrinking line around the last shield generator, and beyond them, still spread across the system, the full weight of 160 surviving Krith warships that had no idea yet what was about to arrive out of transit space behind them. She thought of the 8 ships she had sent ahead, of the 51 souls lost aboard the Solace, of the crew of the Meridian's Hope, and she let herself feel the weight of that cost for exactly as long as she could afford to, which was not very long at all. Fleet-wide channel, she said. All ships, all crews. In 30 minutes, we drop into the middle of the largest battle humanity has ever fought, against a fleet more than twice our size, to save 2 million people, who have been holding on with almost nothing for the better part of a day. Everything we trained for, every drill, every simulation, every year we spent hidden in the dark past Neptune, while the rest of the galaxy fought this war without us, has led to this moment. I will not pretend this will be easy, or that we will bring every ship and every crew home again. But I promise you this, when we arrive, the people of Meridian Station will know, for the first time in 6 years of this war, what it looks like when humanity finally shows up in full force. She paused, looking at the countdown ticking steadily toward 0. Prepare for transit. We are almost there. You heard the captain, she said over the open channel. 30 minutes. We've held for 4 hours. We can hold for 30 more minutes. The galaxy had watched humanity lose for 6 years, had begun to write them off as a species, too stubborn to know when a fight was already lost. It had not yet seen 8 small ships and 400 volunteers throw themselves into a battle they had no realistic chance of surviving alone, buying time with nothing but their own lives and the desperate hope that the rest of their fleet would arrive before the cost became too high to bear. The second fleet dropped out of transit space directly above Meridian Station in a single coordinated burst, 40 ships appearing in the middle of a battle that the Krith fleet had believed, only seconds earlier, was already won. For 6 years, the Krith had grown accustomed to a certain rhythm in their engagements with Concord forces, a predictable escalation of resistance, followed by an equally predictable collapse. Nothing in that rhythm prepared the vessel mind commanding the Meridian assault for 40 unfamiliar warships materializing behind its lines, weapons already charged, moving with a coordination that suggested a decade of preparation compressed into a single devastating arrival. Captain Sarah Cade watched the tactical plot fill with targets and felt the strange, sharp clarity that sometimes comes in the middle of the most dangerous moments of a person's life, a kind of stillness underneath the adrenaline. All ships, engage, she said. Priority targets are any vessel still bombarding the surface, or the remaining shield generators. Protect Vanguard flight. Protect that colony. Everything else is secondary. What followed was, by every account gathered afterward from both human and Concord sources, unlike anything the war had produced in 6 years of fighting. The Second Fleet did not engage the Krith the way Concord doctrine dictated, in organized lines exchanging sustained fire at range. They came in fast and close, breaking into small independent groups the moment they cleared transit, each group hitting Krith formations from multiple angles at once, weapons calibrated specifically to punch through self-healing hull technology before it could respond. Ship after Krith ship came apart in single devastating strikes, the same instantaneous energy spikes that had destroyed the scout ships, and then the cruisers over Meridian Station, now unleashed at full fleet scale. The vessel mind commanding the assault processed the sudden and catastrophic shift in the battle with something that, in a biological mind, might have been called panic, though Krith cognition did not work quite that way. It began issuing orders to concentrate fire on the newly arrived human ships, to abandon the bombardment of the shield generators entirely, and focus every available weapon on eliminating this unknown threat, before it could inflict further losses. But coordination took time, even for the Krith, and the Second Fleet had spent that same time closing the distance, refusing to give the larger enemy fleet room to bring its full numerical advantage to bear in open engagement. Aboard the Prometheus, Marcus Diallo's counterpart in the main gunnery bay, a veteran technician named Chen Wei who had trained alongside Diallo for the same decade, fired the ship's primary cannon in a rhythm that had been drilled into muscle memory across 1,000 simulations and had never once, until this hour, been tested against a living target at this scale. Each shot found a Krith hull. Each hull came apart in the same violent instant, the theoretical weapons research of a decade, validated over and over in the space of minutes. 8 kills, confirmed from Prometheus alone, Elias Brandt reported, his voice carrying an edge of something between disbelief and grim satisfaction. Fleet-wide totals climbing fast. We're taking losses too, Captain, but nothing like the exchange rate the Krith are used to seeing. Casualties? Kate asked, not looking away from the tactical display. The ISS Vigilant took heavy damage, crew evacuating to escape pods now. No confirmed losses yet among the main fleet, but we're 4 minutes into the engagement. That could change fast. It did change, though not in the way the earlier engagements had trained anyone to expect. The Krith fleet, still numerically superior even after the first minutes of devastating losses, began to concentrate its remaining strength into a tighter formation, attempting the same kind of overwhelming mass assault that had broken every Concord fleet it had ever faced. Dozens of Krith warships converged on the human fleet's forward elements, throwing sustained fire against ships that, ship for ship, still had thinner shields and weaker armor than their Krith counterparts. The ISS Meridian Dawn, one of the Second Fleet's heavier cruisers, took the brunt of that concentrated assault and began losing shield integrity within the first exchange. Its captain, a broad-shouldered man named Thomas Ashworth, calling out damage reports over the fleet-wide channel with a steadiness that belied the severity of what he was describing. "Shields at 40% and falling," Ashworth reported. "We're holding position, drawing their fire off the smaller ships, requesting support if anyone's got it to spare." "Ford, redirect 3rd Squadron to support the Meridian Dawn," Cade ordered. "We do not lose that ship." Commander Ford relayed the order, and 6 ships broke away from their current engagements to converge on Ashworth's position, arriving in time to catch the concentrated Krith assault from an unexpected flank and shatter it within minutes. 6 more Krith warships destroyed in the exchange, their formation broken apart before it could finish what it had started against the Meridian Dawn's already weakened shields. Down on the surface of Meridian Station, in the shelter beneath the Colonial Administration Building, Governor Elena Voss watched the tactical feed with an expression that had shifted over the last 20 minutes, from grim resignation to something she almost did not trust herself to name. The overwhelming Krith fleet that had spent the last day and a half grinding methodically through her colony's defenses was breaking apart in real time, ship after ship winking out on the display, the tide of the battle turning in a way that nothing in 6 years of this war had prepared her to expect. "They're doing it," Tobias Reyna said quietly, watching the same feed over her shoulder. "They're actually winning." "Don't say that yet," Voss said, though she found she could not quite keep the same edge of caution in her own voice that she was trying to instill in her aides. "Not until it's over." In orbit above them, the battle continued for another hour, a grinding, brutal exchange that cost the Second Fleet 3 more ships and hundreds of lives, casualties that would weigh on Captain Cade and every surviving officer of the fleet for years afterward, even as the tactical math shifted more and more decisively in humanity's favor with every passing minute. The Krith fleet, which had arrived above Meridian Station with 180 warships, found itself reduced to barely 60 functioning vessels within the first 90 minutes of the Second Fleet's arrival, a rate of loss that no Krith commander in 6 years of total war had ever needed to plan for. It was at this point, with its assault fleet broken and its numerical advantage erased, that the vessel mind commanding the Meridian assault made the decision that would come to define how the wider Krith Dominion understood the arrival of humanity's hidden fleet. It ordered a full withdrawal, breaking off the attack entirely, and directing its surviving ships to retreat back toward Krith-held territory. The first time in 6 years of war that a Krith force had abandoned an active engagement, rather than fight to the destruction of either itself or its target. "They're retreating," Brandt reported, and this time, there was no mistaking the disbelief in his voice. "Confirmed, Captain. The Krith fleet is breaking off. They're running." A silence fell across the bridge of the Prometheus that lasted only a few seconds but felt, to everyone present, considerably longer. The particular silence of people who had spent a decade preparing for a moment they had never truly believed would arrive, and who now found themselves standing in the middle of it, with no rehearsed response ready to meet it. "Do we pursue?" Ford asked finally. Cade considered the question, watching the retreating Krith ships accelerate away from the system, watching the shattered remains of the assault fleet that had, less than 2 hours earlier, seemed certain to destroy everything and everyone on Meridian Station. Her fleet had taken real losses, real people she had trained beside for a decade, were dead, and more were wounded, and the battle was not truly finished until the survivors on the surface and the survivors in orbit were both properly accounted for and cared for. "No," she said, "we hold position. We secure the system. We get medical support to every wounded ship and every wounded person on that surface, and we make sure Meridian Station knows the battle is over before we think about anything else. Let the Krith run. There will be time to think about what comes next after we've taken care of our own." The order went out across the fleet, and in the hours that followed, the Second Fleet turned from an instrument of war into something closer to a rescue operation. Ships moving through the wreckage of the battle to recover survivors, medical transports descending to the surface of Meridian Station to support a colonial medical system that had been pushed past its limits over the last 2 days. Marcus Diallo, still aboard one of the 6 surviving ships of Vanguard flight, found himself helping load wounded crew members from the destroyed Meridian's Hope onto a medical transport, his hands steady despite the exhaustion that had settled into every part of his body over the last several hours. "We held," Captain Reyes said quietly, standing beside him as the transport pulled away toward the main fleet's medical ships. 4 hours, 6 ships, and we held. "We held," Diallo agreed, and looked up at the sky above Meridian Station, where the wreckage of a battle that would be remembered across the galaxy for generations still drifted slowly in the aftermath, and where, somewhere beyond the range of the colony's sensors, a shattered Krith fleet was carrying word back to its own command structure of a defeat unlike anything the Dominion had suffered in 6 years of unbroken victory. Word of the battle reached the Concord Council within hours, relayed through listening posts and confirmed independently by Concord observers who had, by chance, been monitoring Krith communications near the Meridian system when the engagement began. Ambassador Vrenna Kalth received the full report in the middle of the night, local time, and read it 3 times before she fully allowed herself to believe it. 180 Krith warships engaged, more than 120 destroyed. The largest single Krith defeat of the entire war, delivered not by the combined might of the Concord's oldest and most powerful species, but by a human fleet that had, until that day, existed nowhere in any Concord military record. She thought of her conversation with Daniel Osei, of his calm and unshakable certainty that 30 days would be enough to change everything, and found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely without words to describe what she was feeling. Deep within Krith-held space, in a command structure grown rather than built, spread across an asteroid hollowed out over decades into a vast processing hub, the news of the Meridian defeat reached the Dominion's highest command intelligence, an entity the Krith themselves referred to only as the First Pattern. Unlike the individual vessel minds that commanded battle groups in the field, the First Pattern held the accumulated memory of every engagement fought in 6 years of war, a vast and patient intelligence that had watched the Concord's oldest species collapse before it time and again, and had built its entire strategic doctrine around the certainty that no force in this region of the galaxy could inflict losses on the Dominion faster than the Dominion could absorb and replace them. The Meridian data did not fit that doctrine. More than 120 warships destroyed in under 2 hours, by a fleet less than a quarter the size of the force it defeated, using weapons that bypassed the Dominion's signature regenerative hull technology as though it were not there at all. The First Pattern processed the data for what would have been, in a biological mind, a long and uncomfortable silence, running the same numbers through every predictive model it possessed, and finding, each time, the same unwelcome conclusion. The threat designation attached to the species called humanity, unchanged for 6 years at minimal, required immediate and total revision. It issued new orders within the hour, orders that would reach every Krith battle group along the front within days. Avoid direct engagement with any fleet bearing the unfamiliar ship configurations observed at Meridian Station until further intelligence could be gathered. Redirect the primary weight of the ongoing offensive away from human-held territory. Begin, for the first time in 6 years, treating a single Concord member species as a threat worthy of independent strategic caution rather than simple continued conquest. It was, in its own quiet and bloodless way, the closest thing to fear that the Krith Dominion had shown in the entire war. News of the battle spread through the wider Concord in the days that followed, with a speed that surprised even the delegates most accustomed to the endless churn of interstellar communication networks. Recordings of the engagement, gathered from a dozen different sensor sources and pieced together by Concord military analysts, played in council chambers and public broadcasts across 100 worlds, showing 40 human ships dropping into the middle of an overwhelming Krith assault and breaking it apart within hours. For 6 years, the galaxy had watched footage of humanity losing, ship after ship, world after world, a species that fought with a strange and stubborn ferocity, but always, in the end, lost. The footage from Meridian Station showed something the wider galaxy had not seen from any Concord species in the entire war: a Krith fleet in full, disorganized retreat. In the pale stone council chamber where the vote on human military status had been scheduled to take place, Ambassador Vrenna Kalth stood once more before the assembled delegates, and this time she did not need to ask for patience or faith in an unproven promise. She simply played the recording, in full, and let the silence that followed speak for itself. Orith, who had argued so carefully and so persistently for pulling human forces from the front, sat through the entire recording without speaking, Vitsit his expression unreadable in the particular way that older Centaur cultivated as a matter of both custom and long habit. When the recording ended, he rose slowly, and Vrenna found herself bracing for an argument that, after everything the footage had just shown, she was not certain even he still believed in. I proposed reassigning human forces to logistics roles, he said, based on 6 years of consistent losses that suggested humanity lacked the capability to hold a front line against the Krith Dominion. I do not withdraw that proposal because I was wrong about the data I had. I withdraw it because the data has changed, and a counselor who refuses to update his position when the facts shift beneath him is a counselor unfit to hold his seat. He turned toward Vrenna, and something in his old, weathered face that might, in a human, have been called grudging respect, passed briefly across it. I do not know what humanity was hiding during those 6 years, Ambassador, or why they chose to hide it. I would very much like an answer to that question. But I no longer believe the answer is that they are simply a species that fights bravely and loses. I believe we underestimated them, and I do not enjoy admitting that, but I will not pretend otherwise simply to save face in this chamber. The vote to withdraw human forces from frontline combat was not merely defeated. It was withdrawn from consideration entirely, replaced within the same session by an emergency motion to establish direct diplomatic contact with whatever command structure had produced the fleet that fought at Meridian Station, a motion that passed unanimously and without debate. Back at Meridian Station itself, in the days following the battle, the work of rebuilding began even as the wounds of the fight were still being counted. Captain Sarah Cade stood on the observation deck of the Prometheus, looking down at the colony world the Second Fleet had crossed the width of human space to save, and found herself thinking not of the victory, though the weight of it had not fully settled on her yet, but of the cost. 51 dead aboard the Solace, 43 more aboard the Meridian's Hope, 211 names, in total, across the entire fleet, people who had trained for a decade in secrecy and had given everything in the first real battle they were ever allowed to fight. Commander Ford joined her at the viewport, following her gaze down toward the colony below, where evacuation transports that had fled just days earlier were already beginning to return, carrying families back toward homes that had, against every reasonable expectation, survived. 211, Cade said quietly. 211, who saved close to 2 million, Ford said, not as a correction, but as the only comfort he had left to offer, and one that both of them understood was true, and insufficient in equal measure. Governor Voss wants to address the fleet, Ford added after a moment. On behalf of the colony, I think she means to do it in person, if we'll have her aboard. We'll have her, Cade said. Every ship in this fleet deserves to hear it, from someone who was actually down there while we were still hours away. Word of the battle reached Earth 2 days later, and Daniel Osei sat once more in the quiet briefing room outside what had once been Geneva, watching General Webb and Admiral Chen review the full engagement report, with expressions that mixed exhausted relief with a kind of cautious disbelief, as though neither of them entirely trusted the numbers even now that they had them in hand. 10 years, Chen said finally, setting down the report. 10 years of secrecy, of resources, diverted from a dozen other programs, of a fleet that never fired a shot until 3 days ago. You built something that just did what 6 years of the Concorde's combined military strength could not. We built something that bought us time, Osei corrected gently. One battle does not end a war, Admiral. The Krith Dominion lost more ships at Meridian than in any single engagement of the last 6 years, and that will change how they approach us, at least for a while. But they are not defeated. They have not been pushed back. We have shown them, and shown the Concorde, that humanity is not the species everyone assumed we were. What we do with that, over the months and years that follow, matters more than the battle itself ever will. Webb nodded slowly, looking down at the casualty list appended to the end of the report. 211 names that would need to be read, in full, to families across the world in the days ahead. Then let's make sure it was worth it, he said. Send the order to the Second Fleet. Full resupply, full repair, and full integration into the frontline command structure. The galaxy has seen what we built in the dark. It's time we stopped hiding it. 22 days into the 30-day reprieve she had fought to secure, the question the Concorde Council had planned to answer with a vote to withdraw human forces from the front had, instead, then answered decisively by the battle itself. In the 6 months that followed the Battle of Meridian Station, the shape of the war against the Krith Dominion changed more than it had in the entire 6 years that preceded it. The Second Fleet, no longer a secret hidden past the edge of the Sol system, was formally folded into the Concord's frontline command structure, its existence acknowledged publicly by human leadership, in a broadcast that reached every member world of the Concord, and, through intercepted channels, the Krith Dominion itself. Daniel Osei, who had spent a decade working in careful anonymity, found himself, somewhat to his own visible discomfort, standing beside General Webb and Admiral Chen at a press conference watched by billions of people across dozens of species, explaining as much as security allowed about a program that had quietly reshaped the balance of an interstellar war. We built the Second Fleet because we believed, a decade ago, that first contact with the wider galaxy might not go the way anyone hoped, he said, in a voice far steadier than he felt standing in front of that many cameras and that many alien delegates. We hoped we would never need it. We are grateful, and I mean this without any exaggeration, that the crews who trained in secrecy for 10 years were ready when we needed them most, and I am sorry, more than these words can properly express, for every family who lost someone in the battle that finally proved this program was worth building. The Krith Dominion did not immediately collapse, and no one who understood the true scale of the war ever expected that it would. The first pattern, still processing the strategic implications of Meridian, shifted its offensive away from human-held territory, but continued its advance against other Concord worlds, probing for weaknesses, testing whether the new human weapons technology could be countered or matched. 3 more engagements followed over the next several months, each one smaller than Meridian, but each one, without exception, ending in a decisive human victory, as the Second Fleet's tactics and weapons were studied, refined, and gradually shared with allied Concord forces, eager to learn what had made the difference. Captain Sarah Cade found herself, in the months after Meridian, in a role she had never trained for, and had never particularly wanted, something between fleet commander and diplomat, briefing Concord military leaders from a dozen species on tactics her fleet had spent a decade developing in isolation. She did not enjoy the meetings, the endless rounds of questions from officers who had spent 6 years losing to an enemy they were only now beginning to properly understand how to fight. But she understood, in the quiet moments between briefings, standing again on the observation deck of the Prometheus, looking out at stars that no longer felt quite as isolating as they once had, that this was the part of the war that mattered as much as any single battle. Not the fighting itself, but what came after, the slow work of turning one impossible victory into a war that could actually be won. Ambassador Vrenna Kalth requested a private meeting with Cade 3 months after Meridian, aboard the Prometheus itself, the first time in the ship's decade of existence that a Concord official had ever set foot on its deck. Vrenna moved through the corridors with the careful attention of someone who understood she was being shown something few outside a small human circle had ever seen, and when she finally sat across from Cade in the same briefing room where Cade had once given the order to send Vanguard flight into a battle that should have destroyed them, she asked the question that had been sitting with her since the night she first heard Daniel Osei's calm, unshakable certainty. "Why did you hide it?" she asked. "Not the tactics, not the weapons designs. I understand the value of surprise in war. I mean the fleet itself. 6,000 people, 41 ships, a decade of training. You could have offered that fleet to the Concord the day you first made contact with us. You could have joined this war on equal footing from the beginning, instead of watching 6 years of human colonists die, while that fleet sat idle past Neptune." Cade considered the question for a long moment before answering, choosing her words with the same care she had once used choosing tactics in the heat of battle. "Because 10 years ago, when the program started, nobody knew what first contact with an advanced galaxy would actually look like," she said. "We hoped for partnership. We prepared for the possibility that partnership might not be offered, or might not last, or might come with conditions that cost us more than we were willing to pay. A species that reveals its full strength the moment it meets a larger, older community risks losing control over how that strength gets used. We chose, instead, to enter this alliance the way humanity has always approached uncertain situations, cautiously, with something held in reserve. I understand why that choice cost lives in the years before Meridian, Ambassador. I have not stopped thinking about that cost, and I don't expect I ever will. But I also believe that if we had shown the Concorde the full shape of the Second Fleet on the first day of contact, some part of this alliance would look different today, and not necessarily for the better. Trust built between equals who choose each other freely tends to hold up better than trust extended toward whoever simply arrived with the biggest fleet. Vrenna was quiet for a long moment, turning the answer over with the same careful patience she brought to every difficult question, in a long career built on navigating exactly this kind of difficult question. "I do not know if I agree with that reasoning," she said finally. "I lost good delegates to the argument that humanity could not hold a line, delegates who might have pushed harder for reinforcements to the human front if they had known what you were building. But I understand it, and I think, whatever I believe about the choice itself, I no longer doubt that humanity understands something about patience and long preparation that many older species, mine included, may have started to forget after too many centuries of relative peace." "For what it's worth," Cade said, "you were the one who bought us the 30 days we needed. If you hadn't fought for that reprieve, the council vote might have gone the other way, before we ever reached Meridian, and this conversation might be a very different one." "Perhaps," Vrenna said, "or perhaps you would have reached Meridian anyway, and the outcome would have been the same, and I would simply have looked foolish for asking a council to trust a promise I could not fully explain. I prefer to believe the 30 days mattered. It is a more comfortable thought." In the weeks after the press conference on Earth, requests for joint training exercises began arriving from Concorde military commands across a dozen member species, each one eager to learn whatever the Second Fleet was willing to teach about the weapons and tactics that had broken the siege of Meridian Station. Commander Ford, who had spent a decade helping design those tactics in secrecy, found himself now leading a rotating series of officers from the Centaur, the Meraxi, and half a dozen smaller Concorde species through simulations aboard a training vessel assigned specifically to the task, watching alien commanders, who had spent centuries assuming their own doctrine was the finest the galaxy had to offer, slowly absorb the idea that a species barely a decade into galactic contact might have something worth teaching them. It was not always an easy process. Some of the older Meraxi officers in particular resisted the new tactics for months, insisting that the Second Fleet's success at Meridian was as much a product of surprise as of genuine superiority, that Krith commanders caught off guard by an unknown enemy would adapt in time, and the advantage would fade. Ford did not entirely disagree with the criticism, and said as much in more than one heated training session, but he also pointed, again and again, to the engagements that followed Meridian. 3 battles fought by human and mixed Concorde fleets against Krith forces that had already adjusted their tactics in response to the new threat, and 3 battles that still ended in decisive human-led victories. "Surprise bought us the first battle," he told a particularly skeptical Meraxi commander during one long training session. "It didn't buy us the second, or the third. What bought us those was a weapon system built specifically to beat the enemy we were facing, crews trained for a decade before they ever fired a shot in anger, and a willingness to take tactical risks that Concorde doctrine has spent centuries teaching officers to avoid. That's not luck. That's preparation. And preparation is something every species in this alliance can learn from, if they're willing to actually look at what worked, instead of deciding in advance what should have worked." Slowly, over the months that followed, that preparation began to spread. Concorde shipyards, sharing selected elements of human weapons research in exchange for access to advanced Concorde shield and propulsion technology that had, until Meridian, remained largely restricted from human engineers, began producing hybrid warships that combined the best of both traditions, more durable than the original Second Fleet vessels, and hitting harder than anything the Concorde had fielded in the 6 years before Meridian. It was slow work, complicated by politics and lingering distrust on both sides, but it was work that moved forward month by month, battle by battle, each new engagement adding weight to the argument that the alliance between humanity and the older Concorde powers was worth the difficulty of building it properly. Ambassador Vrenna Kalth found herself, in the year that followed her private conversation aboard the Prometheus, becoming something she had never quite expected to be, an advocate not just for humanity's place within the Concorde, but for a broader argument that the Alliance's oldest members needed to actively seek out and value the unfamiliar strengths that newer, smaller species might bring to a fight the Concorde had nearly lost on its own. She said as much, more than once, In council sessions that grew steadily less hostile to human interests as the months passed, and the pattern of human-led victories continued. We spent 6 years assuming humanity's usefulness to this alliance would be measured the same way we measured every other species that came before them, she told the council, during one particularly pointed session, nearly a year after Meridian. We assumed the newest and least experienced member of our community had the least to teach us. I was wrong to make that assumption, and I suspect I was not alone in making it. Whatever species we welcome into this concord next, whatever war eventually forces us to lean on abilities we have not yet had reason to discover in each other, I hope this council remembers what it nearly cost us to underestimate a people, simply because their history with the stars was shorter than our own. A year after the Battle of Meridian Station, the war against the Krith Dominion had not ended, but it had changed in ways that both sides understood as fundamental. The first pattern, forced to abandon the assumption of easy, total victory that had guided 6 years of unbroken conquest, had begun a slow, grinding retreat along the human-adjacent sections of the front, consolidating its forces rather than continuing the aggressive expansion that had characterized the earlier years of the war. Concord military doctrine, reshaped by lessons learned at Meridian and the engagements that followed, had begun to close the technological gap that had made those first 6 years so costly. The war remained brutal, and would remain brutal for years still to come, a fact that nobody who had lived through the losses at Corvassa or New Shenzhen, or the desperate hours above Meridian Station, allowed themselves to forget in the relief of a single turning point. But something had shifted, unmistakably, in how the galaxy understood the newest member of its concord. The species that had arrived a decade earlier, loud and stubborn and seemingly unprepared for the scale of galactic war, had shown the rest of the concord that its quiet years of losses had never been the whole story, that somewhere in the dark past the edge of its home system, humanity had spent 10 years preparing for exactly the moment the galaxy needed it most, and had answered that moment when it finally came. On Meridian Station, in the plaza outside the Colonial Administration Building, a memorial was raised a year after the battle, listing the names of every human crew member lost in the fleet's first engagement, alongside the names of every colonist who had died during the 2 days the Krith fleet spent grinding through the world's defenses before help arrived. Governor Elena Voss spoke at the dedication, standing before a crowd that included survivors from the colony, and, standing quietly near the back in a plain uniform, without the ceremonial decoration the occasion might have called for, Captain Sarah Cade and several of the surviving crew of Vanguard flight. For 6 years, Voss said, the galaxy watched humanity fight this war and lose it, world by world, and many of us who lived under that shadow began to wonder if we had made a mistake, trusting our safety to a species so new to the stars, so unproven in the kind of fight that was being asked of us. I will not pretend I did not have that same doubt in the hours before help arrived, watching a fleet of 180 ships close in on everything I had spent my career trying to protect. But I have learned, over the last year, that doubt is not the same as truth, and that the story the galaxy tells about a people is not always the whole story, and sometimes the most important part of that story is being written quietly, patiently, in places nobody else is watching, until the day it is finally needed. She looked out at the names carved into the memorial, human names and colonist names side by side, 211 crew members, and just over 4,000 colonists who had not survived the 2 days before help arrived. We remember the cost of that day, because it was real, and because forgetting it would dishonor everyone who paid it. But we also remember what came after, because it is proof that even the darkest chapter of a story is not always the last one. Marcus Diallo stood near the back of the crowd that day, listening to the words carried out over the plaza, thinking of Priya Sethi, who had not survived the battle above Meridian Station, whose name was carved into the memorial among the 211, and of the quiet conversations they had shared in the mess hall of the Prometheus in the days before the fleet finally reached the front. 9 days, she had said, the last time they spoke before the strike group launched. 9 days, and then everything that followed. He touched the edge of the memorial where her name was carved, and thought that if she could see what her sacrifice, and the sacrifice of everyone who fell that day, had bought for the 2 million people of Meridian Station, and for the shape of the war still to come, she would have said it was worth it. And he found, standing there in the quiet plaza a year later, that he believed the same thing himself. Back on Earth, in the quiet briefing room outside what had once been Geneva, Daniel Osei sat alone late one evening, a year and a few weeks after the battle, reading through the latest reports from the front. The war was far from over. The first pattern had begun rebuilding its shattered fleets, and analysts across the Concord warned that the Krith Dominion would eventually adapt fully to the new human weapons, that the advantage bought at Meridian Station would not last forever without continued innovation and continued sacrifice. He had spent a decade building something in secret because he feared exactly this kind of war, and now that the fear had proven justified, he found there was no particular comfort in having been right, only the steady, unglamorous work of making sure the next decade of preparation was even better than the last. His screen chimed with a message, a routine update from the training command, now overseeing recruitment, for a second and third generation of ships modeled on the Second Fleet's designs. Young men and women signing up in numbers that surprised even the recruiters, drawn by stories of Meridian that had spread across Earth and its colonies in the years since the battle. He thought of Sarah Cade, still out at the front, still carrying the weight of 211 names she had sent into a battle she could not reach in time to fully support. He thought of Priya Sethi and the 50 crew of the Solace, of the 4,000 colonists on Meridian Station who had not lived to see the fleet arrive. He did not believe, and had never believed, that any of it had been simple, or that the victory erased the cost, and he found that he did not want to believe that, because forgetting the cost felt like its own kind of failure. He closed the report, and for a while simply sat in the quiet of the empty briefing room, looking at nothing in particular, before finally rising to draft the next set of orders for a fleet and a war that were both still very far from finished. The war against the Krith Dominion continued, and would continue for years to come, fought now by a Concord alliance that finally understood the full weight of what its newest member had brought to the fight. The galaxy had watched humanity lose for 6 long years, had begun, quietly and almost apologetically, to write off a species that fought with everything it had, and still could not seem to hold the line. It had not understood, until the fires above Meridian Station finally answered the question, that humanity had never truly been losing at all. It had simply been waiting, patiently, in the dark, for the moment its dangerous fleet was finally needed, and the galaxy, having watched that fleet arrive and change the shape of a war 6 years in the making, would not make the mistake of underestimating humanity again.